She means nothing to me. It's just business. It's just, I'll be back. How you doing? ImmersionRC Ghost is here, and a whole bunch of people have finally started getting their orders. And that means a whole bunch of people are asking, where's a setup guide? And that's what this video is for. Now, if you are one of those weirdos who likes to read instead of watching awesome tutorial videos, Ghost has a user manual. It is a very, very detailed user manual. It's available from the ImmersionRC website. I'll put a link in the video description and you can download that if you want. But for those of you who prefer to listen to a YouTube influencer tell you everything you need to know, this is the video for you. And the first thing that you're going to have to do as you go into setting up Ghost is figure out how to connect it to the flight controller. The receiver that most people today are going to be working with is the Ghost Atto receiver. In fact, at the time of launch, it's the only receiver that's available, and it has 4 pins on it, 4 pads on it. One is ground, one is 5 volts for power. That's just like any other receiver. And one is serial output. And that is the one that's going to connect to your flight controller and be used to get the signal into the flight controller. Now, the reason that wiring up the Ghost receiver is not cut and dried is that Ghost actually supports multiple receiver protocols. So it can output SBUS, it can output fast SBUS, it can output uninverted SBUS if you've got an F4 flight controller, but for some reason you're not able to use the SBUS pad on it. And it can output SRXL2, which is a spectrum-based protocol. And in the future, it will, like, why doesn't it just have like Ghost protocol? You know how like Crossfire can output SBUS, but it also just outputs Crossfire. Ghost protocol support is coming. It is not currently in beta flight, and so it's just not something that's available today. The protocol that most people should decide to use is going to be SRXL2. And the reason for that is that it has the highest baud rate and the lowest packet duration. It's just basically the lowest latency of the protocols that Ghost supports. If for some reason you want to use SBUS, you should use SBUS Fast. Betaflight does support it, and it has nearly as fast as Ghost. Not quite as fast, but maybe half as fast, and still pretty freaking good. If you've got an older flight controller, or for some reason the firmware you're using doesn't support SRXL2 or SBUS Fast, you can use SBUS and everything will work, but it just won't be as low latency as it possibly could be. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that none of these protocols support telemetry at the time of release. That will come when the official Ghost protocol is finally built into Betaflight and other flight control software. So if you're wanting telemetry, you're not going to get it as of today. So here is the Atto receiver, and this is a Holybro Kakute F7 flight controller. And if you assume that you're going to use SRXL2, which is what's recommended, you're going to take the signal output pad and you're going to connect it to any UART TX pad on the flight controller. So T3, T4, T6, etc. If you have an F4 flight controller and you don't have a spare UART TX pad, like because you've just used them all for other things, you can connect the signal output to the SBUS pad on your F4 flight controller, and you can do it that way. I can't think of any other reason why you would want to use SBUS since SRXL2 is higher performance and doesn't have any issues with like inversion. There are 2 firmwares that we need to update before we can take full advantage of the Ghost system. One of them is the firmware on your radio itself. OpenTX 2.4 will have full support for the Ghost protocol, but OpenTX 2.4 isn't out yet. It's been coming soon for, well, anyway, that's another topic. So we need to update the firmware on the radio, and we need to update the firmware on the Ghost module itself. And yeah, the Ghost module surely ships with the latest firmware on it, but there's always new firmware coming out, especially at the beginning of a product's life cycle. The updates come fast and furious. It's just a good idea. In order to get the firmware to update Ghost, you're going to need to go to this webpage. Link in the video description for your convenience. This is the ImmersionRC Ghost page, and right here we've got a link, OpenTX binaries for Ghost. So we'll click that, and that is going to bring down this zip file. which we can open, and it contains firmware files for all of our radios. So you're going to pick the firmware file for the radio that you've got, and you're going to update it. And if you've never updated your radio before, I have a whole nother video I made about how to update OpenTX. I'll put a link to that in the video description, but I'm not going to show that in this video for the sake of conciseness. So at this point, if I press sys and then page to the version screen on my radio, you can see the version screen shows OpenTX TX16S, ImmersionRC. ImmersionRC, that means you have the Ghost firmware on your radio and you're ready to proceed. So the next thing you're going to do is you're going to either create a new model on your radio for your Ghost quads, or if you're converting your existing quads over to Ghost, you can take your existing model and just change it to be the Ghost type receiver instead of whatever you're using now. So if I just long press the jog wheel, the exact key presses you use are going to depend on your radio. Some radios don't have a jog wheel, they just have an enter key. But we go to the model select screen. We can either take an existing model and duplicate model and then change it over to Ghost, or we could just go into the existing model and change it to Ghost, depending on if you were going to keep some of the old receiver around. But either way, we're going to go into our model setup screen, and we're going to go to the internal RF section, and that needs to be off. And for external RF, we're going to take the mode and we're going to set it to Ghost. And when we do that, the Ghost receiver will power up. The next thing we need to do is download the ImmersionRC drivers for Windows. If you have installed these previously, for example, if you own RapidFire and you install these drivers so you could update your RapidFire module, then they're already installed on your system and you don't need to do it again. But you download and install the ImmersionRC drivers and download the Ghost Updater Click and Run. Ghost Updater Click and Run also comes down as a zip file, and that zip file contains just one little exe or executable. And I have a folder on my hard drive, RC Utilities, where I put such things. It doesn't have an installer per se. You're just going to drag and drop that anywhere you know on your desktop into a folder or whatever, and run the Ghost Updater Click and Run. Now the Ghost module has a USB plug on top. It does need to be powered up from the radio. It will not power up if you just plug in USB with the radio powered off. So we're going to plug that in. When you do that, this menu will change from No Device Found to show the COM port that the Ghost is on. Then you can pick your version, your firmware version, and hit Start Update, and it will update. Now that your firmware is up to date, the next thing to do is bind the receiver. In order to do that, I'm going to click the joystick one time. Bind is selected. I'm going to push the joystick to the right to go into the menu. And the next thing I need to do is select the protocol that I'm going to be using from the receiver. Now we've already said that SRXL2 is the one that you want to use if at all possible. So I'm going to select SRXL2. You can select SBUS, which is just standard SBUS. SBUS Fast, which is fast SBUS as used originally by the DJI system. And if you have to use SBUS, that's the one you're going to want. There's also SBUS Inverted, which is actually uninverted SBUS. If you have an F4 flight controller, but for some reason you can't use, maybe you lifted the SBUS pad and you want to use a standard receiver pad, that is the one you're going to want. And there is also PWM. There are 4 PWM outputs on this receiver if you're working with like a fixed wing plane. So we're going to select SRXL2. And then the other thing is you can output LQ or RSSI on an aux channel. Actually, you can technically do both of them on different aux channels, but since Betaflight doesn't have the ability to read more than one RSSI aux channel, you would never be able to use more than one at a time. By default, LQ is output on channel 12, and you can go into the Betaflight receiver tab and set the RSSI aux channel to be, it would be aux 8, which is channel 12, and that would get you LQ. However, if you're using SRXL2, you do not have to do this. You do not have to give up an aux channel. With SRXL2 protocol, the LQ is read automatically by the flight controller. And if someday you're using the Ghost protocol, presumably the same thing will be true. So we're going to set this to SRXL2 and we're going to start bind. Then we need to power up the receiver. Hey there guys, Joshua from the future here. This is the receiver that I'm about to show you how to bind, and there's no antenna connected to it. And just like this is a receiver, but it's also a transmitter because it has telemetry. Telemetry transmits. So just like a video transmitter, if you power this up without an antenna connected, you can burn it out. Well, you burn out the telemetry anyway. Now, ImmersionRC has a great history of building very robust technology that is resistant to that kind of nonsense, and hopefully that's true. Otherwise, I just burned this guy's telemetry transmitter out. But before you proceed, hook up an antenna to the receiver. Don't do what Joshua in the past is about to do. And if this is the very first time you've powered up this receiver, then it will automatically go into bind mode without you having to do anything. I've actually already bound this receiver one time. I forgot to hit record on the camera, so I can't show you that. But I'm going to power the receiver up, and then within 30 seconds,
telemetry recovered.
Within 30 seconds, you need to hit the bind button here to put it in bind mode. What you just saw happen is that if you have ever bound the receiver before to this module, it will automatically rebind. You don't need to hit the button. The goal here is to make you have to hit the bind button as little as possible. So if for any reason you need to rebind, like you're changing the receiver protocol or just for any reason, automatically it will do that. Now at this point, if your receiver needs a firmware update, you'll get a message here on screen asking firmware update yes or no, and you'll push the joystick to the right to complete the firmware update. The firmware update does happen over the air. It's wireless, and there's nothing you need to do in terms of like pass through or plug in or any of that nonsense. It's all completely automatic. I also did that and forgot to hit record on the camera, so I can't show you that, but there you go. Now there are a couple more things we need to do in the flight controller to finalize the link, but before I show you those things, let's just take a look through these menus real quick so you can see what's here. And on the default screen, you can see there are link stats like RSSI, SNR, LQ, and so forth. One thing to keep in mind is that these stats are the stats for the telemetry uplink, which is only at like, I think it's like 20 milliwatts. So if you're operating at 350 milliwatts downlink, you're going to get much greater range, and you can even get a situation where these stats just show complete blank and you still have fine control. So this is giving you some idea of what the link's like, but it's not the full capability of the link for that reason. If we then push to the right with the joystick, we can get the firmware status and input voltage for the module, the channel inputs, and these, if I can just reach under my radio here and move one of my joysticks, these show the There we go. These show the input to the module from the radio, and I can go down to see the remaining 16 channels. If I go over to the right, I can see the frame latency, and to the right again. And this screen lets you control a tramp video transmitter from the module. So we discussed this signal pad here, but we didn't talk about what the T pad is for. The T telemetry pad gets wired to the telemetry input of any ImmersionRC tramp receiver. The Tramp Nano is the one they're really focused on. And when you do that, you can control the video transmitter output power and channel using the module. This would be instead of smart audio from within Betaflight. So if I click the joystick one time, go down to the mode menu and go to the right, we can change the RF mode. The default RF mode is normal, which has 55 hertz refresh rate, pretty good latency, and amazing range. We can change that to race mode, which has 166 hertz refresh rate, which is great latency and still pretty amazing range. And we can change that to pure race mode, which has 222 hertz refresh rate, which is just amazing latency and shorter range, but still probably more range than a typical 2.4 gigahertz system. And no telemetry. Pure race gives up telemetry to get the maximum possible refresh rate. Finally, there's long range mode, which drops the refresh rate to only 15 hertz. That is way too slow for like freestyle or racing, but it's enough that if you were doing like a long range airplane, you could be able to keep it in the air and like do basic flights, and you just get the maximum possible range. Real quick note, if you are using long range mode and SRXL2, the update rate of long range mode is so slow that Betaflight assumes that SRXL2 has just timed out and fail-safes. So what you need to do if you're going to use long-range mode is don't use SRXL2, use
SBUS.
TX mode is used to control what protocol the receiver expects to get from the radio. You should probably never have to change this. The default of auto will work in most cases. There is a spectrum analyzer. You can read the 2.4 gig spectrum in your area. You might think that you could use this to detect like, Wi-Fi networks and stuff, but the Ghost protocol is actually very, very resistant to interference from Wi-Fi devices, so that's probably not going to be a problem. This is mostly a novelty in my opinion. The antenna setting lets you control what antennas are used on the module and the receiver. In theory, if you only had one antenna for some reason, you might set it to use only antenna 1 or only antenna 2. But most of the time, you're going to be using the Ghost module with 2 antennas in a diversity configuration, and auto is what you want. Finally, TX power lets you change the transmit power. Auto will ramp the power up or down as need be to based on the range and penetration that's needed for the link. However, you can manually set the output power. With Crossfire, a lot of people don't like to use dynamic output power because they feel like there's little glitches in the link when it changes power. Ghost is still too new to say, but some people are going to prefer to set this to a manual output power, like 350 milliwatts, which is the max, and they're just going to manually set it and leave it there. You will run your battery on your controller down a little faster, but try auto. You never know. Maybe it'll work great. But if it doesn't, you can set it manually. Finally, the failsafe setting, and this is only used if you're using PWM output from the receiver. If you're using any of the digital protocols to a flight controller, you're not going to need to change failsafe at all. Failsafe will be handled by the flight controller.
Well, okay, the last thing you're going to need to do before you go fly and enjoy your new Ghost system is set up the flight controller. And the way you set up the receiver is, in some respects, no different than any other, but there are a couple little gotchas that I want to make sure you're aware of. You're going to go to the Ports tab, and you're going to enable Serial RX for whichever UART you connected to. So TX3 is UART 3, RX6 is UART 6, and so on. If you have an F4-based flight controller and it just has an SBUS pad, you're going to need to look in the documentation for your flight controller to see which UART the SBUS pad is connected to. We're going to enable Serial RX, and we're going to save and reboot. We'll go to the configuration screen, and we're going to set the receiver type. It's going to be serial receiver, and then we're going to choose the protocol. Most of us should be using Spectrum SRXL2 until the time when Ghost protocol is available in beta flight, and then we'll switch over and use Ghost. If you're using SBUS, you'll choose SBUS, and that's pretty much it. That's pretty much the only thing you're going to be using. Now, at this point, you can go to your receiver tab and see if you have any movement in your receiver tab, and you may not. If you don't, let's go to the CLI. There are a couple things you may need to do. If you're using SRXL2, you are probably going to have to type set serial RX underscore half duplex equals on. SRXL2 almost always requires that, and save. If that doesn't work, the other thing you may need to do is type set SRXL2 underscore baud underscore fast equals on, and type save. Now that's on by default in a lot of flight controllers, but it may not be on for yours. If you are using fast SBUS instead of standard SBUS or SRXL2, you will probably need to go into the CLI and type set SBUS underscore baud fast equals on, and save. Fast SBUS won't work unless you do that, and that you're going to need to do on all flight controllers. None of them ship with fast SBUS enabled by default. And that is going to bring us to the end of this video. Thank you so much to ImmersionRC for making this great product. Thank you for watching. If you want to see how I tested Ghost's range, there's a link in the video description to my Ghost range test video. Ghost goes like 40 kilometers, and I can't fly that far legally, so you can check out how I tried to overcome that limitation. It involved a lot of walking. Link in the video description to that, and also link in the video description to if you want to pick up Ghost. There are links there, and they are affiliate links. That's one of the ways I support myself, is by you click that affiliate link, buy the Ghost system, buy anything. You actually get credit for any purchase you make after you click one of my affiliate links. It doesn't have to be for that specific product. So you want to support the work that went into this video, I sure would appreciate it if you would. Well, lots of things you could do, but using those affiliate links is one of them. Thank you so much for watching. Happy flying.
What are you still doing here? The video's over. Do you watch all the videos all the way to the end? Wow. You are a super fan. Thank you. That actually helps the channel a lot when you watch the videos all the way to the end. YouTube loves that. You know what else YouTube loves? When you subscribe. Or when you join my Patreon for as little as $2 a month or more if you feel like I've earned. Actually, YouTube doesn't like you to join my Patreon. They don't get a cut of that.